Thank you all, and thank you all for being here. So I wanted to start, actually, with a picture of my family, circa 1927. The guy all the way on your left is my grandfather, Morton, and the two people seated next to him are my great-grandparents. And I bring them up because that's the Rutenberg family, which is a German name. It roughly means Red Mountain. And as family lore puts it, sometime around World War I, my great-grandparents, seated there, sat around the table and sat and really thoroughly discussed, do we change the name? From Rutenberg to Redmont, sort of an Anglicization of Red Mountain. Sometimes I wonder, what would it be if I were Amy Redmont instead of Amy Rutenberg and all that stuff about what goes into a name? But the bigger historical question for me is what makes people actually sit down around the kitchen or dining room table and think, my name may not be good enough. I am actually worried that something may happen to me. What should we do? It's something as personal as a name. And so to me, that's a really interesting way of sort of diving into this question of World War I, because it is an event that affected real people in very, very real ways. Now, I've been tasked with talking about the causes and consequences of World War I in 30 minutes, go, which any teacher in the room knows is pretty much an impossible task. So I'm going to move along relatively quickly and pretty much at surface level, but if anyone has any questions, absolutely feel free to ask. Very quickly, how many of you all have actually studied something around World War I? Okay, good. Some of you. So some of this I hope is review. For those of you who it's new, definitely ask the questions you have. So I'm going to run through the causes in Europe really quickly because the war started in Europe and elsewhere around the world before the United States came in. And so oftentimes we talk about three main reasons for the causes of World War I. And the first one is imperialism. So by 1913, the territories of the world had pretty much been divided up by the great powers of Europe as well as the United States. And no one was particularly interested in fighting wars over those borders. However, there was incredible competition between the great powers of the world for territorial, political, and economic resources, because as far as the great powers were concerned, power itself was a zero-sum game. That meant that if some other country was gaining more power, you necessarily were losing it, right? The balance had to be maintained. And so the goal was forever grow your power, grow your resources, grow your wealth. Okay? So to keep from falling behind, the nations of Europe started creating an alliance. Ooh, that would be the wrong button. An alliance system. Basically, through these alliances, two blocks begin to form. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, pictured here in orange along with some other smaller nations, as well as France, England, Russia, and Japan. So that's one thing. You get this alliance system that begins to be created. The second cause is listed as nationalism. And nationalism is a term that's been in the news a lot. It can be a controversial term. It has a lot of meanings. But in this particular case, it does mean fierce pride in your country, but it's something much greater than just simply patriotism. It comes out in two ways during World War I. First, as a belief that your country is not only the best country, but that everything your country does and the reason for its existence is to grow its own power and to grow its own importance and prestige. So in the lead up to World War I, the major powers were all concerned about showing their own might and also getting revenge for perceived slights. Because if some other country did something that somehow removed their power or made them look lesser, then the notion was, under this idea of nationalism, that you had to fight back, that you had to prove that you were in fact the most powerful. It also came out through ethno-nationalism, which was the idea that sort of basically you and people like you should have your own nation. So if I jump back here for a second, you can see in the middle that there was a Serbia, but there were also Serbian people living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the people who were Serbian, their ethnicity was Serbian, they felt that they ought to be part of Serbia instead of the Austro-Hungarian nation and that they should secede, some of them. So that idea obviously is making the major powers like Austria-Hungary nervous because they don't want a lot of their people and thus land to secede because that would remove power. The third major reason is militarism. Military operations were seen by all of the great powers as legitimate tools of foreign relations. They were a way to gain power or maintain power through war or the threat of war. And so as a result of that, military spending in Europe begins to balloon in the 19aughts and early 19-teens. It increases 50%. Military spending increases 50% between 1908 and 1913 in Europe. That's an incredible jump in a very short period of time. And it goes beyond spending. The economic and social structure of nations began to shift with that focus on the military. And that happens in ways big and small. So for example, in Germany, every single horse in the nation of Germany was declared a part of the reserves, so that if war broke out, those horses could be easily requisitioned by the military, right? They were already considered part of the military. They could thus be taken. Right? More importantly, military leaders gained great power politically within most of these nations. So what you have, at a certain point, there's almost an economic argument for using your military. And an example that someone talked about, who I know, said, like, if you buy a lawnmower for your house, like, why would you buy one unless you're going to mow the lawn? If you're going to spend money to buy a lawnmower, it's probably because you want to mow the lawn, not because you want to just leave it sitting in your garage to collect dust. At a certain point, if you spend all this money and put in all these resources into the military, you're going to want to use it at a certain point, right? You don't want all that material just sort of sitting in warehouses collecting dust and going bad. So, in other words, and by the way, this picture is for the 1st Rhodesia Regiment in Africa. It's a German, not German, I'm sorry, it's Rhodesia was English at the time. Anyway, point is that it's a global conflict, right? Okay. So by 1914, the European nations were, 1, vying for supremacy. 2, they were allied for and against each other. And 3, they were incredibly well armed. So when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife Sophie are assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in the summer of 1914, that really was all it took to align and pull these nations into war, one after the other, through their alliance system. The US in 1914, however, was very interested in staying the heck out of the war because, quite frankly, the war in those first couple years was a mess. Now, I could have pulled all kinds of images of dead bodies and other things. I decided not to put that up there for varying reasons, but rats just kind of sums it up, right? Trench warfare was awful. And to give you all a sense of it, during the campaign around the Somme River in France in 1916, 1.5 million people died over 7 miles of land. So the fighting was fierce and difficult and deadly, and the US really didn't necessarily want to be part of it. There was also the question of which side would the United States come in on. If you look at the population of the United States in 1914, almost 11 million Americans had at least one parent from Germany, Austria-Hungary, or Italy. At the same time, over 10 million Americans had at least one parent from England, France, or Russia. So they were almost evenly divided in terms of family loyalties. And just on the surface, that's not always easy to parse out anyway. For example, Ireland and Irish Americans were not very fond of Britain because Britain refused to give Ireland its independence. So as a result, what side would the US come down on was not immediately apparent. But neutrality was difficult. By the usual laws of war, neutral nations are allowed to trade with belligerents. So neutral nations can trade with both sides, and belligerents, the warring parties, could trade with neutral nations. That's how it had always worked. But the British blockaded German ports, refused to allow Americans to trade with the Germans, refused to let German ships out of German ports, which left America saying, well, we could trade with Britain, but they're doing something they're not supposed to do. But then unrestricted submarine warfare basically changes everything. The submarine was a brand new technology, right? And the way that naval warfare had always worked up until the invention of the submarine was that a ship from a warring nation flying that warring nation's flag would stop another ship and pull off all the citizens from neutral nations before then sinking the ship. and potentially killing everybody else who was on board. But the whole point of submarines is secrecy. A submarine does not pull up beside a ship and say, hey, Americans, get off, I'm about to sink this ship. The point was that there was secrecy and that they would just sink the ship. Right? Germany put ads in American newspapers telling Americans not to sail on British ships. Right? Here's an example. Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, and that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction. So don't sail on them. Signed, the Imperial German Embassy. The problem is, who's going to listen to this? Right? Nobody. They're not reading, people read the newspapers, yes, but they're not, it's an advertisement in the newspaper, don't sail on a ship. If someone needs to go somewhere, they're probably going to go. And so what happens is that in 1915, in May, a British passenger liner called the Lusitania is torpedoed, killing almost 1,200 people. Of those 1,200 people, 128 of them were Americans, including 37 women and 21 children. Now, as it turns out, the ship was not wholly innocent. It was carrying 4,200 cases of small arms, right, guns, headed to the war in Britain. But it was a moment when many Americans became outraged at these American citizens, including women and children, who aren't, and I've been asked this by my students sometimes, like, are women and children considered better? The answer is no, but they're generally not considered, particularly in this time period, to be warriors, right? They're not fighters. So to kill them is to really talk about killing innocent people. President Wilson of the United States issued a series of statements demanding the stop of unrestricted submarine warfare. And after several more diplomatic incidents around the sinking of ships, Germany backed down in 1916 and the US stayed out of the war. But the United States does begin to drift toward Britain and its allies. Britain, first of all, controlled the telegraph lines out of Europe after it cuts the lines that from Germany, right? The telegraph ran its lines just like the telephones under the sea. And so you cut those cables and there's no more messages coming directly from Germany. Moreover, since the official language of both the US and Britain is English, there were definitely ties of cultural affinity between Britain and the United States. And propaganda began to filter into the US, pretty much showing the Germans as monsters. And here are a couple of examples. These are English ads and propaganda posters, but they begin to show up in the American press, right? That Belgians are being destroyed by the Germans. Belgium had been invaded. And also, the second poster talking about, again, women and children are being killed by German, quote, raiders, right? And then, on top of that, comes the Zimmermann telegram. So Arthur Zimmermann is the German foreign secretary. He sends a telegram, it's a little complicated, but he sends a telegram to Mexico. And what that telegram essentially says is, 1, Germany is going to start up unrestricted submarine warfare again. 2, Germany really hopes the US will stay out of the war, but recognizes that once submarines start sinking ships again, probably the US is going to enter. 3, if the US does enter the war, Mexico, would you like to be allied with Germany? Mexico could declare war on the US and slow down US mobilization, which would allow Germany to win the war. And in return, Mexico could then have back the lands of the American Southwest that had been taken back in the 1840s and slightly thereafter. The British actually intercepted this telegram in January of 1917, but held on to it until the end of February, once that unrestricted submarine warfare had restarted. So in and amongst the bad press of the restart of unrestricted submarine warfare, that's when Britain gives the US this telegram from Germany to Mexico. And then when several American merchant ships actually were sunk, it became too much for the Americans, and the US declares war in April 1917. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on American actual involvement in the war itself, and there are reasons for this. It was an important war, and it was very important that the Americans entered the war, but if you look at the way that American mobilization took place, Americans were not actually in the trenches fighting for very long. The US declares war in April 1917 and sends troops to Europe about a year later. This is because it takes a year. The American army was almost non-existent in April 1917. They had to instate the draft, they had to get people into the military, they had to train them, they had to get them the equipment and then get them overseas. And so that takes almost a year. And then the war itself, as was just mentioned a few minutes ago, the armistice is signed in November 1918. So in terms of military involvement, the United States is only involved for a little over 6 months. However, the US involvement was incredibly important. It helps break the stalemate of the Western Front, of that trench warfare. It gives a lot of, aside from actual people to fight the war, it also gives a lot of moral support to the British and the French, and ultimately the war is ended. But the thing to note is that mobilizing the American populace, the other reason why it took a year, is because it's not easy. Wilson had won re-election in 1916 based on his promise to keep the US out of the war. And then a mere 6 months later, he's saying, well, I take it back, we actually probably should enter this war. So the war itself had to be sold to the American people, all right? And it's sold, the person put in charge of this is a guy by the name of George Creel. He's put in charge of this Committee for Public Information. And he and Wilson begin to talk about the war as one of idealism, as the war to end all wars, and to make the world safe for democracy, right? To really play on these ideas of liberty and freedom and democracy, and that's what the war is about. So Americans need to do things like buy war bonds to help support the American government fight this war. And then along with that comes the demonization of Germans and any of those who seemed to have connections to Germany. So, if you take a look at this poster, how many of you have seen it before? It's one that's commonly used in a classroom, okay. What is the German here portrayed as? Actual question, feel free to answer. A giant monkey monster. And what is that giant monkey monster doing? Yes. What, right here? Yeah, killing the woman. What do you think the woman represents? Yeah. People who got killed on ships and stuff? Absolutely. Any other ideas? Citizens? Any other ideas? Innocence. Sorry, thank you. Yes, innocence. Any other ideas? I heard it. Yeah. Liberty too, right? You guys have talked about liberty as a woman as well. So all of these things, all of that is wrapped up in this poster here to try to make Germans look like brutes, right? Like monsters who are breaking the laws of civilization. And so laws, most notably the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, were passed, making it illegal to criticize the government, criticize the draft, criticize really any aspect of the war. Patriotic societies begin to demonize Germany and all things German. Sauerkraut becomes liberty cabbage, hamburgers become liberty sandwiches, dachshunds become liberty pups, orchestras stop playing German music, including Beethoven and Bach. Towns and streets were renamed across the country. Berlin, Iowa was renamed Lincoln, Iowa. Businesses are renamed. German Savings Bank becomes the Lincoln Savings Bank. That's here in Iowa. My mortgage was with them, actually. And in the state of Iowa, the legislature actually passes a law forbidding the use of German in any public form, including in church services, including in instruction in schools, and even on the telephone, because telephones were actually public. You had party lines. People could listen in on your conversations. But the idea was that you couldn't have German even talking on the telephone. This was called the Babel Proclamation. And it was not particularly unique in the United States. So, legacies. And there are a whole bunch of things I haven't talked about. But if you have questions about some of these, please do ask them. So, number one, approximately 117,000 Americans did die during World War I, both in combat and from influenza, and you will hear about the flu in a moment. But somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 million people died worldwide as a result of this war. It was a massive, it wasn't the most deadly war that had happened in history at this point, but it was a really brutal war. You also have the growth of the federal government. The Committee of Public Information was really just the tip of the iceberg. If you think about it, what is a military draft? Conscription is the government telling men, you have to serve in this military. It's a growth of government. You have rationing of things like food and rubber and oil and other things out to the people that starts during World War I. So you have incredible growth of the federal government. You also have modernization of the American military. It's during this point in time when the American military really begins to take on the shape that it currently has in terms of the reserves are defined in the same way that the reserves are now and the way that the organization is set up. You have the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote, or at least women who are in places where they can vote. That is a pretty well direct result. Women had been agitating for the right to vote for decades, but because of women's participation in the war effort, ultimately the 19th Amendment passes almost as a reward for women's participation in the war effort. You have the first Great Migration, which is the beginning of a massive migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North and eventually to the West. You have the first wave of that Great Migration happens as a result of job opportunities that are available in the North resulting from the war effort. That migration picks up really significantly through the 30s and particularly during World War II in the 40s. You also have America's return to isolationism after the war. I'm not really talking a whole lot about the League of Nations or Wilson's post-war plans for the world here, but the bottom line is that this impulse to be the savior of democracy and to really become involved in world events, it dissipates very quickly in the United States after World War I because it was such a devastating war. And you also have increased nativism in the US, right? This project of selling the war by demonizing others, particularly Germans, almost backfires on the US government. It becomes hard to control the people, and there are riots and pogroms against German Americans in certain places, but it also is an opportunity for people who are afraid of people from elsewhere to also get laws passed and do some things that they've been trying to do for a very long time. So you get quota laws passed in 1924 that significantly limit immigration from all over the world into the United States. It was passed at that point. You have a Red Scare, fear of communism, that grows as a result of World War I and of the Russian Revolution, which comes directly out of World War I. And you also have, as I've alluded to, this loss of German culture in the US, that people, it becomes sort of subsumed into the greater American culture as the German language and other things become lost and not taught. So that is sort of brings me back to my family. They ultimately chose not to change the name, but they were operating within a time period when people very much did, right, where they're very significantly talking about that.